the Within Orb podcast. Come get Within Orb. Hello, my name is Jenn Zahrt, and welcome to Within Orb, a production of the Celestial Arts Education Library, a podcast bringing people together around the love of astrology, books. Join me as I interview people about the astrology books that changed their life and practice. You can support the podcast at withinorb.com. Welcome to another episode of Within Orb, and today I'm introducing you to my colleague and fellow holder of a PhD, Michael, and we are visiting them in Columbus, Ohio. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jen. I'm really excited to be here and to be talking about astrology and books.
Yes, so good. Books. But I also love your work because you are so embodied with your work in this somatic culture and always reminding us to get outside of our head and back into our bodies. So how would you introduce yourself in that context and maybe beyond that context to someone who doesn't know your body of work?
Thanks. Well, first, thanks for just recognizing that as part of the orientation of my practice. I would say that I'm an astrologer and I'm a tarot reader. I am an artist, specifically a dance artist. I'm a writer and I'm an educator. And my astrological practice is primarily rooted in Hellenistic astrology, but also very much shaped by feminist methods of thought, which has to do with my academic background. My PhD is in dance studies. I have multiple degrees in dance. And so I'm also coming from a strong orientation to my work from the body, from the ways that we exist and live as bodies, which are always implicated in systems of power and gender and control and all of the ways in which we are constituted socially, which is where a lot of the feminist theory comes into my work. And in my astrological practice, I guess I also bring a lot of myth and story into my practice by way of working with the minor asteroids. That's the part of my practice that's not exactly Hellenistic, but also has to do with my lineage and who I studied with and who shaped my astrological practice. But yeah, and getting out of our head and back into our body, and also recognizing that those things were never separate in the first place, that dichotomy has been imposed by, thousands of years of philosophical orientation and civilization that conditions us to think of ourselves as separated or separate in these ways. So what happens when we start to re-engage with ourselves in this kind of whole self, or moving towards more of a sense of the ways in which these things have always been implicated in one another?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that goes back very much to the root of pre-literate culture.
Yeah.
It's so foundational. So I love that you're bringing that into our modern consciousness and also, allowing us to think with our body and not just the mind.
Mm-hmm.
What was your first astrology book?
My first astrology book was Isabel Hickey's Astrology, A Cosmic Science, which I got from a used bookstore in Jackson, Mississippi, when I was in my first or second year of college. I was in my early years as a practicing witch, and I had been reading Rob Bresney's Free Will Astrology in the local free press in Jackson. And I think I picked up that book because I wanted to understand, more about the framework and the vocabulary that I was encountering in these horoscopes, but also, as a witch, I wanted to understand what other witches meant when they're like, oh, this full moon is going to be in Cancer. And it's like, I don't really know what that means. I know that there's a full moon, but I think that's why I reached for that book. And honestly, I haven't read it in over a decade. I wouldn't say that it was foundational to my practice in any way, that it was other than Rob Bresney's horoscopes, it was my way in to starting to understand the complexity of the astrological tradition beyond sun sign horoscopes.
Yeah, that's a title that I haven't heard a lot about, but it does have, that kind of textbook feel to it. So it's neat that you're beyond the newspaper encounters or the kind of column-based horoscopy, you went into a textbook. That's really cool. Who is your main lineage then, if it's not Isabel?
Yeah, my main lineage in terms of my studies has been Demetra George by way of Chani Nicholas, that I encountered Chani Nicholas's work probably in 2015, 2016. I had already started studying astrology more deeply while I was in grad school and just became enamored with Chani's very particular queer feminist approach to writing about astrology. And then she would talk about her teacher, Demetra George. And so I started taking online classes with Demetra and buying Demetra's books. And then from Demetra's work, learning about ancient astrology and Hellenistic astrology, I went on to study with Chris Brennan, continuing to study with Demetra, and then went on to study with Kelly Surtees, who also has moved into a more traditional approach to her astrological practice as well. And so those are my primary teachers, but Demetra has really been a through line through most of my studies and how I approach astrology, and thus how I ended up a practitioner of Hellenistic astrology who also works with asteroids, because those are two of the large bodies of work that Demetra has contributed to.
Right. Yes. She's gone her one hand all the way in the past and another all the way in the sort of cutting edge of discovery in astronomical remarrying astrology, right?
Right. But even the asteroids, the ways that she works with them, yes, definitely at this kind of front edge of contemporary astrology, but also part of how she works with the asteroids and part of how I work with asteroids is through myth. So even this very modern astrological technique brings us back into the ancient past, into these archetypal stories that have been unfolding through our lives, through our civilizations, through our felt and lived experiences all along. And so even this very contemporary approach, at least in my practice, but I think in Demetra's as well, is also very much rooted in the ancient past, and it specifically through mythology.
Amazing, amazing. So here's the question of the hour. If you were going to be stranded in a desert island, what would be the 3 books you would take with you?
You know, this is such an interesting question, and I think I would answer it in a couple of different ways. The first is the very limited scope in terms of if I was only bringing 3 astrology books with me, they would probably be Demetra George's Astrology and the Authentic Self, which was really her first attempt in a published text to synthesize ancient and modern astrology. And then her 2 volumes of Ancient Astrology in Theory and Practice, which are these remarkable transmissions of the ancient tradition, synthesized and made really accessible for contemporary students trying to access those ancient traditions. In that sense, I would probably end up on a deserted island with 3 books by Demetra George. I mean, I could wax poetic about Demetra for our entire time together, but just to say that I think she's probably one of the most significant and influential astrologers, not only living today, but I think her work, especially her transmission of the ancient tradition, are going to be pillars in the astrological community and in the ongoing tradition for many, many years. But then if I open my frame a little bit and think about what books I would want with me to inform my astrological practice that aren't necessarily astrology books, 3 other texts come to mind. You know, my academic work is intensely interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. I think that our understanding of one discipline or practice or framework can shift or grow significantly when we consider it within the context of another discipline or system or framework, or bring it into conversation with thinking from a different field. Actually, one of my favorite quotes from Black feminist philosopher Angela Davis reads, quote, "Feminist methodologies impel us to explore connections that are not always apparent, and they drive us to inhabit contradictions and discover what is productive in these contradictions. Feminism insists on methods of thought and action that urge us to think about things together that appear to be separate, and to disaggregate things that appear to naturally belong together," end quote. And, you know, in the practice of astrology, we're already doing this. We're already thinking about things together that appear to be separate. Celestial bodies and their motion, and terrestrial experiences and events. And so what does it do to think about these things together? And then what more does it do to think about our astrology in relation to something else, to other fields, other disciplines? I'm very interested in questions about how we make meaning. And one of the fields that's been really important to me in terms of asking and answering questions about meaning making is feminist theory, specifically feminist science studies, which has done a lot of critical thinking around the production of knowledge and the destabilization of the authority of things like scientific objectivity or technological determinism. And so a couple of the texts that I'm thinking about for this deserted island come directly from feminist science studies. And then a third text that I would say is adjacent to, or definitely building on similar interests or concern to feminist science studies. I think the first text that I would name is an essay by Donna Haraway called Situated Knowledges, The Science Question in Feminism and the Privilege of Partial Perspective, which was published in a book called Simians, Cyborgs, and Women, The Reinvention of Nature in 1991.
I love where you're going with this, because that question about meaning making and this dominance of science as a questioning of astrology's validity is so pivotal to all of the social relationships astrologers have trying to justify being one in this day and age. So what does Donna bring in her essay?
Yeah, so in this essay about situated knowledges, she's really describing the interrelationship and ultimately the inseparability between epistemology, ontology, ethics, and politics. It's an essay that's really about challenging the assumptions of so-called objectivity, or a view as if from nowhere, or what she calls the God trick, as if we could see something as if from nowhere, and addresses the conditions and the power relations through which so-called objective knowledge is produced, as well as the ethical and the political consequences of claiming objectivity, when in fact all knowledge, including scientific knowledge, is always co-created within specific situated configurations that are always what she describes as both material and semiotic, both the literal mechanisms through which knowledge is being produced, by which I mean like computers and laboratories and experiments and whatever the systems of measurement are being used, as well as semiotics, our sense of language or meaning making or symbol or representation of the material in some way. I guess I should emphasize, Donna Haraway is a feminist biologist. She's a scientist thinking about how do we make knowledge in science? How does science constitute knowledge? So this isn't like someone who's anti-science saying like, these are the shortcomings of science. This is someone who's deeply embedded in scientific disciplines and trying to think more critically about how it is that science makes knowledge. And I guess, it's so fascinating that these are the texts that speak to me, because I'm actually not so interested even in astrology as a science, because I'm coming more from the arts and humanities and my disciplinary orientation. I really think of astrology more as an art. But the reason that I like these contributions from Haraway and other thinkers in feminist science study is because it asks us to think critically about our assumptions around how it is that we are making meaning, or how it is that we come to knowledge in some way. And I think those are assumptions that a lot of people, including a lot of astrologers, maybe haven't thought about before, or haven't questioned, or haven't even realized that there are assumptions that are underlying our meaning-making processes.
That's very, very, very critical. Also, because it seems like the objectivity that you spoke to is claiming a space, and then people who are practicing something that seems subjective, the art part of astrology, are then by default constantly on the defensive, instantly, like just from the very first moment on the defensive about practicing something that is subjective versus engaging with something that's theoretically objective, right?
Right. And I think part of what Haraway is contributing in this essay from the 90s is even troubling this binary of objective and subjective, and focusing on what she calls situated, that it's not that this knowledge isn't true or isn't real, but that it is created, that it's constructed or crafted under particular conditions. So rather than knowledge being something that's like out there in the world, just waiting for us to encounter it or discover it or uncover it, she's really focusing on the ways that knowledge is constructed using specific methods and tools and systems of measurement and language and bodies and biases, always under particular conditions. And those conditions are always a part of whatever knowledge we produce. And so she advocates for the partiality of knowledge, which doesn't mean it's not true or not real, but that it is true or real under certain conditions. And those conditions are part of it, a part of that knowledge. And we can think about that in terms of astrology in like really practical ways, like how we make meaning with the sky depends on systems of observation and measurement and the graphic representation of those measurements using symbolic systems like a chart. And then the traditions with which we interpret those symbols and the languages with which we articulate those interpretations, all as a body that is situated in time and space and sociocultural contexts that shape the meaning that we're making. And then we can see how that plays out when there are changes to those, again, what Haraway would call the material semiotic conditions of that apparatus, things like using a different zodiac or using a different house system, both of which are about systems of measurement that we project onto the sky, changes what knowledge we are capable of producing, what we choose to include or exclude from our astrological practice, whether that's visible planets, outer planets, fixed stars, asteroids, the Ptolemaic aspects, the minor aspects, mathematical points like the nodes or the lots, hypothetical objects, all these things that we could include or not include, all of that changes the knowledge that we're capable of producing and the meaning that we make of that knowledge. And so this is where these contributions that Haraway is making in this essay have really kind of immediate and practical application in how I think about what is it that we're actually doing when we practice astrology. Does that make sense?
Total makes sense. And I find it fascinating that she's published this in 1991. And in the 2 years following, Project Hindsight would congeal. And if you put her text together with that historical event, then Hellenistic astrology as we do it today is not Hellenistic astrology as it was done in Hellenistic times. It's very much a product of, maybe even millennial turn of the millennium kind of astrology because of the material conditions of possibility for the translations that were happening, and also the absence of certain source texts because we only have what survived.
Exactly.
And so I love this. I mean, I'm going to have to think about that for the rest of the day. This imagination of the situatedness of what we even call traditional astrology.
Yes, exactly.
Imagine stepping into a room of 5,000 astrology books, turning a corner and stepping into a room of 2,000 more. The Celestial Arts Education Library is every astrologer's dream, and it can be yours. I invite you to come support CAELi before you can visit physically. Your support will mean the creation of 52 new episodes of Within Orb next year, 4 issues of the CAELi Review, our inaugural journal, and countless book talks, events, classes for our community. Visit our website, www.caeli.institute/support, to select your level of care. Please help support CAELi into the future, our future, so that we may study the future together. Thank you for listening. Please enjoy the rest of the show. So, do you have a second text?
I do. And it's actually interesting that there's a pretty direct relationship between these texts. The next one that I was thinking of that I think every astrologer would probably benefit from reading this book. It's a substantial book by Karen Barad. It's called Meeting the Universe Halfway, Quantum Physics and the Entanglement of Matter and Meaning. And it was published in 2007. And Karen Barad is a feminist quantum physicist who teaches at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And there's a number of consistencies between Haraway and Barad's work. They cite one another, but they also literally taught in the same department at the same university. So they're engaged in a similar project around these questions of meaning. So in this book, Barad is drawing on quantum physics and specifically the work of Niels Bohr and the ways that quantum physics calls into question the entire tradition of so-called Western metaphysics, the belief that the world is populated with individual things with their own independent sets of properties that are pretty determinate, and instead asserting the ways that properties become determinate through different apparatuses, different methods of observation and measurement, different configurations of material conditions and what we call experiments, and all these different ways that we generate knowledge. And so in other words, part of what Barad is asserting, well, part of what quantum physics is asserting, is that what something is, its ontology, depends upon how we attempt to know it. its epistemology or the epistemology with which we're approaching it. And like a famous quantum physics experiment is the difference between a wave and a particle, that the same thing exists differently depending on how we observe it. And so if that's true, if there aren't things that are separate from the methods of observation or the methods of engagement with them, and that the object of knowledge is always in some way implicated in the conditions through which that knowledge is created, then there's a certain inseparability of all of these different factors that are part of the process or the project of knowledge production, such that we're not separate from the knowledge we're producing. If we think about this in the context of astrology, there's an inseparability or an entanglement between us and the planets and the books of translations that have been passed down through generations, and the computers that generate our charts, and the internet through which we engage with our clients or in this podcast and so on. Like, all of these different factors are part of not only that which we know, but also that which we are knowing through those processes of engagement. Does that make some sense?
Totally, yeah. It just makes you think very much like how necessary a you-ness is. Like, you are here and you are participating in this with others, and we're all connected. And then what part of you is you and what part of your chart is you, and then maybe defamiliarizing that and softening the gaze a bit and having a different awareness. I mean, it's wonderful, honestly. But I see what you mean. Like, and it makes me think also, Rick Levine will always love quoting this when he says, well, the moon isn't actually there. It's a wave until we look at it.
Right. I love that you used the word participate, that we're participating in, because that's very much how I think about astrology. That I think when people ask me, like, what is astrology? I more often than not say that astrology is an assemblage of agencies that are both human and more than human, that's always emerging from a cloud of determinacy and indeterminacy. It's very much a human practice of co-creating meaning with the more than human. Most notably the sky, the planets, the stars, the asteroids, light, motion, but also our place here on Earth, but also the body with which we're witnessing all of this. Like, anything that we interpret in astrology was made available to us through the particular sensory motor apparatus of our bodies, our eyes, our visual senses, but also language and myth and archetypes and technology and social systems and cultural biases. And let's not forget mystery. The great mystery of how does any of this work? How is, we might even say, the magic of all of this? Like, all of this is part of the apparatus or the assemblage that astrology is. Which is to say, I think that astrology is never been simply a practice of decoding unilateral messages from sky gods, as if there's a singular message and it's our job to apply techniques to it in order to find the right interpretation of that or the decoding of that message. That it is actively a co-creative process that we are participating in with the sky and the earth and all of these other agencies that are part of the meaning-making practice that we're engaging in.
Mm-hmm. And going back to what you said, Barad said about the individual, we share zodiacal degrees. And when you see enough charts, you kind of realize that there's nothing special about having, your sun at 0 Cancer or 19 Cancer. And you start to see other people have things there too. And you're like, wait, but that's mine. And it's like, but is it yours? You're sharing this. I mean, we can only have placements in certain places. And then you start to study time of a century, for example, the 20th century. And it's like, after a certain point, you're not surprised to see Uranus conjunct Pluto in Virgo, because anyone born in the 60s has that. So now you realize, like, oh, even just seeing that piece of data lets you extrapolate, like, oh, that individual must have been born at this time because that's the address for that temporal address. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then if we go back to the 1700s and see Jean-Baptiste Morin de Villefranche, the last great French astrologer of the traditional school before everything went underground for a couple hundred years, he says that if someone is indicated in the 7th house to have, a certain kind of other in relationship, they will always find someone suitable to fill that role. So through the lens of the tradition, actually, we don't have that sense of I or the individual, because there is a way to fold the chart data such that you start to see how other people show up in your life very, very literally and explicitly. Like, what does your preferred other look like? What does your dog or cat look like, right? Like you can actually get to these very specific interpretations of the relationality between a certain type of role that any kind of relationship can play in your life, and then how that plays itself out, and how people who are not you are relating to each other through your vantage point.
Mm-hmm.
So I really love that. I've never thought about how that traditional approach to the chart actually speaks to a pre-existing entanglement in a way, because, you know, in that sentence from Villefranche is like, yeah, you'll always find somebody to do your seventh house with that's appropriate for that role.
Well, and part of what Barad talks about, and part of what comes out of quantum physics, is that relations precede separable objects, that they are not objects that then enter into relationships. There are relations, and then within those relations of entanglement, or what Barad talks about as intra-activity, not interactivity, intra-activity within the relation, those seemingly separable persons or objects come into existence through that relation. And I think that's so clearly demonstrated in the chart. I actually don't think the chart is a description of an individual per se, as much as it is the description of a life that is composed of countless relations, of which, as you said, there is a vantage point, a perspective of the native described by the ascendant, but then everything else in the chart is describing the ways that that life is constituted in and through these relations that maybe become inhabited by different people or different experiences at different times. But yeah, I think that inherent relationality and entanglement might be in astrology all along. And also there's a way in which Barad and Haraway's work in particular has been really useful for me in terms of thinking about that relationality in the practice of astrology, not only in what is described in the chart, because I absolutely think that's there, but also in the actual practice of what is it that we're doing as we're making meaning in these complex assemblages of relationships. That's really where this work excites me, and why it's been just so vital to how I approach this practice.
I can totally see why. Yeah, no, it's got me sparky. So I'm super grateful for you bringing those to my awareness in that way. You said something that the third book is slightly different. So what is your third choice, and what would that be? What's the difference?
Yeah, the third book is by Adrienne Maree Brown. It's called Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds, and it was published in 2017. And Brown is not an academic. Brown is not writing in the discipline of feminist science studies. And yet this is a book that is really engaged with similar questions in the sense of understanding our relationship to change through a study or an examination of the more than human world, through things like biomimicry or the other ways that the world around us offers us wisdom or strategies for being with change in some way. And Brown observes different patterns and behaviors in things like mycelium and ants and ferns and the wavicle. Is it a wave or is it a particle? And the ways that starlings move together as they're flocking, and dandelions and how dandelions grow. And so she's really asking what these different parts of the more than human world can teach us about being with and shaping change. Her jumping off point for Emergent Strategy really comes after or following with the work of Octavia Butler, who wrote in her books Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, quote, "God is change. All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change," end quote. And I think that astrology has been a practice of navigating change as a constant for thousands of years. It's a way of maybe revealing to us or attenuating us to the currents of change with which we're moving, the qualities of time that are unfolding through us or that we are moving through in some way. And so then if we recognize that change is constant, it's part of what we're constantly navigating, and that part of the role of astrology, especially, when we're getting into dynamic timing techniques, especially, but also the natal chart itself unfolds over time. If we understand that part of the orientation of astrology is toward change, then I think part of what Emergent Strategy offers me is then how do we want to be with the change that we observe, that astrology is making us aware of or attenuating us to? What is our response to the transits or the progressions or the Time Lord periods that we see on the horizon? How is it that we want to engage with that change, to shape it, to be shaped by it, to be intentional in how we are adapting to these different qualities of time and these different currents that are moving through us or that we are moving through in some way?
I love that you say the word response, because another word could have been reaction. And I think when you have astrology in your pocket, then response becomes possible.
Yeah, exactly. And we have tools with which to respond. Then Emergent Strategy is organized around a set of principles that Adrienne Marie Brown articulates throughout the book, which offer maybe some suggestions for how to respond. I won't go through all of them, but it's things like small is good, small is all. The large is a reflection of the small. If we were to take that seriously, how would we then respond to a transit or a progression or a new Time Lord period that looks really immense? It's like, what if the response can be small? What if small is already enough? That's part of the concept of emergence, that emergence itself is the way that, I mean, this is part of the definition that Brown offers, is part of the way that complex systems and patterns arise out of a multiplicity of relatively small interactions. So what is a small response to something that might seem immense? Or one of the other principles of emergent strategy is what you pay attention to grows. How might that be a resource for moving into a new perfection year or engaging with a transit that might feel really intimidating on the front end or before it's arrived? Like, what if what you pay attention to grows is part of how we engage with the change that we're moving with or moving through?
I love that. Yeah. And it's a very true thing too. It's almost like the attention itself is a kind of currency or nutrition, a kind of energetic nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't wait to read more of that. I did have that actually as I was putting CAELi together in a very physical sense, like moving into the building. That was a book that was given to me by a friend of mine. So I've had it on my Tsundoku pile for quite some time.
Wonderful.
So it's great that you're going to take that with you to the deserted island.
Mm-hmm.
So climbing out of there now, let's direct ourselves towards what texts would you recommend to somebody just getting into astrology for the first time?
You know, the first text that I often recommend to people, to students, to clients, to people who are beginners, who know nothing about astrology yet, is Chani Nicholas's You Were Born for This, Astrology for Radical Self-Acceptance, which I have heard recommended on this podcast before. So this is just a reiteration of that recommendation. Chani is one of my all-time favorite writers, not only in astrology, but especially within our field. I think there's such a vivid clarity to how she articulates meaning in astrology, to the ways that she writes through the astrological archetypes, and then the ways that she connects that with so much richness, not only to our felt lived experiences, but also to the social and the political forces that act on and through our lives. And that book is really a vibrant introduction to the places of life, to the ascendant, the ruler of the ascendant, and the sun and the moon. It's not an introduction to the entire system of astrology. It's not even an introduction to the entire chart. It's just focusing on these key points that I really think of as part of the deep structure of the chart, or at the very least, how it maps life's purpose and the ways that everything else in the chart kind of moves with or around those key places. And so I definitely recommend that as a book for people who are total beginners. But honestly, I recommend it just as reading material for people who are more advanced in their studies as well, because of the beauty with which Chani articulates these archetypal qualities and forces that make up the astrological tradition, or at the very least, the astrological system. So that's like my top pick for beginners. And then frankly, I think that Demetra's Ancient Astrology in Theory and Practice, I mean, it's a lot. These are huge books, so they might feel a little insurmountable at the beginning, but you can build an astrological practice from the ground up using those texts.
Wow.
It really starts at the beginning and gives you everything you need in order to start to understand how to make meaning in astrology. So if people get through You Were Born for This and they're like, I think I would like more, Those 2 volumes are more than enough to get people through a beginner, intermediate, and into an advanced astrological practice.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for spending time with me today and sharing all of your perspectives and widening everyone's frame to get into the feminist science studies and how that can double back on helping us position ourselves in a different way towards the celestial and get ourselves into a more conscious awareness of how we're participating in this practice together. Where can people find you and learn more about your work?
Well, first, just thank you so much for being in conversation and inviting me to be here and for being willing to open the frame and think about our astrological practice within the context of larger questions about how and why we make meaning. It's been a really satisfying conversation to be part of. In terms of where people can find me, the best place is my website, which is michaeljmorris.co. And then the social media that I'm most active on is Instagram. And on Instagram, I am at Co-Witchcraft Offerings, all one word.
Okay. And there'll be links in the show notes for everyone. And what are you working on now?
Oh, what a beautiful question. I am doing a lot of writing right now that is becoming a manuscript and also conference presentations and also workshops. It's becoming a lot of things. But it's really focusing on the topic of feminist astrology. What does it mean to engage with ancient astrological traditions through a more contemporary feminist consciousness? How do we understand the archetypal significations that we've received from this tradition through feminist methods of thought? So very quick examples, like when we say that the moon signifies the body, what do we mean by the body? When we say that Venus signifies love, what do we mean by love? When we say that Jupiter signifies freedom, what do we mean by freedom? And I'm drawing on a lot of different feminist texts, especially Black feminist thinkers, to articulate different perspectives of understanding these ancient astrological significations. And so that's really the focus of a lot of my work right now, alongside doing consulting work with clients. That's my primary work. But then beyond the consulting space, a lot of writing about feminist astrology.
I love that. I can't wait to read all of the things you're producing in that ecosystem.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Thank you for listening to Within Orb. To learn more about the Celestial Arts Education Library, or to become a member, visit our website at CAELi.institute. That's www.caeli.institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please help spread the word. Follow or subscribe to Within Orb in your podcatcher of choice, rate it 5 stars, or write us a happy review. This helps others find the show. We also want to give a big thanks to the indie band The E-Block for contributing their song Wake Up for our intro and outro music. You can find them at their website, eblockband.com. This is Jenn Zahrt, signing off for now. See you next time.